In this unit, we're going to do an introduction to Windows Server 2012, and I'm going to set the table for the rest of the course and just discuss the topics broadly, and we'll get into all of these topics in more detail throughout the course. So our objectives in this unit is first to talk about the function of a server operating system in a network. We're going to describe the different editions available for Windows Server 2012, and many of these are similar for 2016. We're going to define what a private cloud is and some of the terms and technologies when dealing with the cloud. This has become an important part of Windows Server. A lot of people are moving to the cloud, so it's important for us to understand the cloud. We're going to explain some of the core technologies available in Windows Server 2012, so some of the core functionality and technologies that you have available to you in Windows Server, and we'll talk about some of those, and what the different roles are in Windows Server and some of the features, some of the new and enhanced features that are available in Windows 2012 and also in 2016. And there are a few other features available in 2016 that you can also learn about outside of this course. So I'll talk about each one of these items, and we will talk about each one of them, of course, in much more detail throughout the rest of the course. I'm just going to give you a broad kind of overview of each of these topics in this presentation. Before we begin, though, I'd like to talk about what a network operating system is. And network operating system is not a term that most people are familiar with. We all talk about operating systems, but what exactly is a network operating system? So a network operating system is an operating system that's providing services for us on a network. So that could be authentication services, file services, and so forth. Windows has had network operating system functionality since Windows NT 4.0 and continues to do so today. So the function of a server depends on the type of business using the server, the size of the business, and the extent to which the business has committed to using technology to aid operations. So a server is used to provide services that aid operations of an organization. When we say the extent to which the business has committed to using technology to aid operations, some businesses don't really need servers. They are not, technology is not a core part of their business. For example, a small business maybe that does auto repair maybe doesn't need a server. Maybe they're even just doing things on paper. So not every business requires a server, but many businesses do. And even some large businesses don't really need a lot of server infrastructure compared to even some smaller businesses that need a lot of server infrastructure. So it really depends on the business and the scenario as to whether or not they need a server. And one of the first questions that comes up about servers, when we define what exactly is a server hardware or is it software? And really, a server is kind of a little bit of both. Could you have a server that is, that doesn't have server-grade hardware? Absolutely. For example, Windows 8.1 and Windows 10, which is more common today, could be used as a server. It's not designed to be a server, but it has some of the services available baked into it that allow it to run as a server. So it could function as, say, a small web server or a file server or a server, a print server for print sharing, and even to some extent some of the other services that we talk about in this unit. But it's not designed to be a server. So Microsoft has their offering obviously is the server operating systems, which is Microsoft Windows Server 2000, NT4, 2000, 2005, 2008, 2012, and now 2016 as well. We're going to cover in this class Windows Server 2012, R2. So we're going to start with Windows 2012 R2. So some of the services that you'll find as part of the Windows 2012 package is file and printer sharing. It has a web server, remote routing and remote access or RAS services, the DNS or domain name system, dynamic host control protocol or DHCP, the file transfer protocol, Active Directory, distributed file system, Hyper-V, and a fax server, but although that's not really used much anymore. Although I work in healthcare, so we still use fax servers quite a bit, but they're not terribly common. Some of these services are available in Windows 10 or Windows 8.1. So in Windows 10 or Windows 8.1, you can use Hyper-V, file and printer sharing, web server, and FTP server to some limited capacity. So these are the services that we're going to talk about throughout the course. In fact, if you look at your syllabus for this course, you will see that I cover all of these services. We're going to talk about each one of these individually. I should mention that we don't cover the fax server so much in this course. I will talk about that a little bit, but we don't talk about that very much. But the rest of these I do talk about in some degree of detail. I will tell you, however, Active Directory is a special case. Active Directory is a whole course unto itself. It's a very involved and a very complicated portion of Windows 2012 Server and all the versions of Windows Server. So I will talk about that in a different course. So there is a follow-on course to this course where we go into more detail on Active Directory. So we talk about things like group policy, Active Directory domain controllers, and all that sort of thing. What I will do in this course is we'll have an overview of Active Directory, and we'll learn a little bit about Active Directory and what it's used for, and some of the basics of Active Directory. But we won't go into the detail that you might find in an Active Directory course. So Windows 8.1 is, and Windows 10 for that matter, are restricted to 20 logged on users, whereas Server is limited only by your licensing and your hardware. So it's designed for many more users than a desktop-based operating system like Windows 8.1 or Windows 10, or even Windows XP or an older desktop operating system. So Windows Server 2012 R2 includes fault-tolerant features as well, such as RAID 5, RAID up to 5 volumes of RAID. I apologize. RAID 5 is a type of RAID. We'll talk about that later, though. It does support load balancing and clustering. So that's all about high availability. So it's fault tolerance and high availability. And again, these are things that you typically can't do with workstations. So it is an enhancement that you get by using a server. So servers include or give us the ability to use all of these different network services that you see listed here. And in addition has the ability for fault tolerance and high availability like load balancing, clustering, and RAID. And we'll talk about some of those technologies later on. There are various editions available for Microsoft Windows Server. In Windows 2000, Server 2008, there were many more editions, so it's been streamlined quite a bit since Windows 2008. So let's talk about some of the editions. We have Data Center, Standard, Essentials, and Foundation. So these are the 4 basic versions of Windows Server 2012. You'll find that in Windows 2016 it's very similar. Businesses can choose the best solution for their size and the services required, and hopefully this presentation will give you some idea on when each edition is appropriate. So Data Center Edition is sort of the Cadillac of the editions. This is the the highest volume. It has the highest capability as far as performance. You can install an unlimited number of virtual instances of the operating system. So Data Center with Hyper-V can be installed on a physical server, and then you can install as many virtual machines as you need within that virtual server. So Data Center Edition you can think of as your private cloud platform, basically. And we'll talk more about what a private cloud is later on, but that is the platform that Microsoft markets for a private cloud. So you can basically, you take a large piece of hardware, some really high-end hardware, you can install Data Center Edition, and then you can install Data Center Edition instances within that VM or within that server as virtual machines. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. You can have lots of these virtual machines running. And this is how most data centers seem to operate today through virtualization. So you must purchase 1 Data Center Edition license for every 2 physical processors installed on a server. So that's how they capture revenue on the hardware side. So typically you're not going to have hundreds of virtual machines running on hardware with only 2 processors. You'll typically have many processors. You might have 32 cores or something like that with hundreds and hundreds of machines running, or virtual machines, or the potential for all those machines running. So they basically charge you a license per processor on the data center, on the host operating system for data center. But then you can spin up as many VMs as you like within that. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. Now, Standard Edition has all the features of Data Center Edition and the same processor licensing conditions, but it permits only 2 virtual instances. So you can only install 2 virtual instances rather than unlimited instances. So it really wouldn't make sense to put Standard Edition on a super powerful server and pay for all of those processor cores because you can only really run 2 instances of it. So really Standard Edition is more designed, it's designed less to be virtualized and more as a standalone, either a standalone server, and when I say standalone I mean a physical server as opposed to virtualized server, or a small office or something installed on some dedicated hardware somewhere in a small office or in a closet somewhere. So it's not going to be typically found in large data centers, at least not with virtualization. So both the standard editions, data center and standard editions support up to 4 terabytes of RAM. That's quite a bit of RAM, 4 terabytes. That's more hard drive space than most people have. Up to 64 physical processors, so that's quite a bit of processors, and server clusters with up to 64 nodes per cluster. I feel like we should probably talk about clusters just a little bit. So when you hear the term clustering, what we're talking about is more than one server providing services at the same time. So you might have 4 servers all listening on the same virtual IP, all providing services simultaneously, so that if you have a failure in any one of those servers, the services continue to run as if the users have no idea that there's a failure. So it's all about fault tolerancy and redundancy and high availability and all those other buzzwords that we hear about. So it is important to understand what clustering is, because this is the primary method we use for high availability in a server, in server platforms. So I did want to just briefly mention what clustering is, and we'll talk about clustering a little bit in this course, although it's not the focus of this course. So both editions have the option to be installed without a standard graphical user interface, which is important, and that's a mode called Server Core, which is currently the default. So the default mode for Microsoft Windows Server, starting with 2012 and continuing into 2016, is to use the Server Core mode, where you don't have a full graphical user interface. Obviously, when you install Windows 10 or Windows 8.1 or any of the earlier versions of Windows, you have a pretty powerful GUI, and that's really kind of one of the things that I think made Microsoft Windows successful, was because of that powerful GUI they had. But on the server side, I think what happened is, a lot of folks realized that the GUI isn't really necessary on the server. The server's not designed for people to use it, to be sitting in front of it and using it like a desktop. The server is designed to provide services on the network. It should not be something that we're using, that we're regularly sitting down in front of and opening up a Word document and typing up something. It's not designed for that. It's designed to provide services. So the core version, or the core mode, is now the default, and it makes sense. And you can get pretty small installs for the core operating system. I'm sure most of you know, if you install Windows 7 or Windows 8 or Windows 10, you need a lot of space to install the components that come along with Windows, and a lot of that is based on the GUI. The GUI also uses a tremendous amount of processing and memory. When you're running Windows 10, for example, you'll notice that a lot of your memory and processing is being used for all of the fancy GUI functionality, especially if you turn on, in Windows 8.1 and Windows 7, they had the arrow interface, but if you turned it on, it would use a lot of processing time. We don't need to be wasting those resources in a server environment. Both editions require a client access licenses, and basically they are mandated for each user who logs onto the server. So in addition to any of the other licensing that we talked about, you do have to have the client access licenses. So Essentials Edition, so we talked about Data Center, we talked about Standard Edition. Essentials Edition is aimed at small businesses with fewer than 25 users. So it's automatically configured as a root domain controller. We're going to talk about domain controllers later on, which is part of Active Directory. And other automatically configured services include Active Directory, DNS, file services, web services, network policy server, and remote desktop services. So, and it also comes with a management interface called Dashboard. Again, no heavy GUI like our desktop operating systems, and no CALs are required. So this is an easy version of Windows Server to run on a smaller organization. You don't have to worry so much about how you're going to license it. All that stuff sort of goes away. There are some limitations on processing and memory, which are not listed in this slide, that would make it inappropriate for organizations that are larger than 25 users. So it is somewhat limited in its functionality because of the performance that you will get out of a server running on the limited hardware resources that it supports. But this is a great option for a medium-sized or small business with 25 or fewer users. And remember, a business could have 1,000 people and still use Essentials Edition if you only have 25 people that are users. For example, say you have a manufacturing plant where the vast majority of the employees are working on a factory floor, but you have a small office staff of, say, 20 people. That's a good candidate for Essentials Edition. So you can't always look at the size of a company to determine exactly which version, which edition of Windows is appropriate. When you work on your assignments for the course, and if it asks you which edition is appropriate, make sure you think about the user count, not the employee count. or not the revenue of a company, for example. That doesn't always indicate exactly which edition would be appropriate. And finally, we have the Foundation Edition, which is an entry-level edition, and this is for very small businesses, usually for under, I want to say under 15 users typically. It's available as an OEM version only. What that means is you cannot buy Foundation Edition to install on your own hardware. This is if you go on Dell.com or HP's website and you go to buy a server, you can buy the server with Foundation Edition as a part of that server. So it's one way, I think, to reduce the cost of servers for those OEMs without diluting the licensing for Microsoft for the other editions. So it is limited to 15 concurrent users, and no cows are required. You just can't use you just can't have any more than 15 concurrent users. It supports a single physical processor, so that's pretty limited, and only up to 32 gigabytes of RAM. So again, it is somewhat limited. You can configure it as a standalone server or a root domain controller. So if you recall, Essentials Edition is automatically configured as a root domain controller. Foundation Edition really is kind of the same as Essentials, only it doesn't have to be installed as a root domain controller. It could also be a standalone server. So it's definitely a good option. I see, the only thing in this list I think that makes it somewhat limited is the single processor requirement. So if you need more than one processor, this is not an appropriate choice. But for many sort of lower end server needs, this is a good choice. Oh, and it does not support Hyper-V, so you can't do any virtualization with this product. This is from your textbook, from your Cengage textbook, and this compares all of the different editions. So we have Data Center, Standard Essentials, and Foundation. Here you can see all of the limitations for these different editions, and you can compare these. And this is a good guide that you can use as you complete the assignment in this unit, where I ask you to look at the different editions of Microsoft Windows Server and try to determine which one would be appropriate for a fictitious organization. So that concludes our discussion on server editions. Next, we're going to talk about the private cloud.